I never expected the phone call that would change my life forever. It was late on a Thursday night when my friend Alex called me, his voice shaky and panicked. "You have to meet him," Alex said, almost whispering into the phone. "Detective Brick. You won't believe what's been happening." At first, I thought Alex was playing a prank. He had a reputation for exaggerating things, and I wasn't in the mood for his antics. But something about his tone unnerved me. I reluctantly agreed to meet him the following evening at a diner just outside town. The next day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself seated in a booth at the nearly empty diner. Alex walked in, accompanied by a man who looked like he had stepped out of a noir detective novel. He wore a trench coat, a fedora tilted low over his forehead, and carried an air of quiet authority. "This is Detective Brick," Alex introduced him. The detective nodded curtly and slid into the booth across from me. His eyes were sharp and piercing, as if he could see right through me. "Alex tells me you're a skeptic," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I wouldn't say that," I replied, shifting uncomfortably. "But I do like to see things for myself before I believe them." Brick leaned back and studied me for a moment. "Good. Skepticism is healthy. But there are things out there that don't care whether you believe in them or not. They exist regardless." That's when Alex started to explain why he had brought me here. For the past month, strange things had been happening in his apartment. At first it was small, lights flickering, items going missing, and faint whispers in the dead of night. But things had escalated. He had woken up one morning to find deep scratches on his bedroom walls, as if something with claws had been trying to get in. Alex had called the police, but they dismissed it as a prank or his imagination. That's when someone recommended Detective Brick. "What kind of detective are you?" I asked, trying to mask my skepticism. Brick smiled faintly. "Let's just say I handle cases that don't fit neatly into the realm of the ordinary." The plan was simple. Brick would investigate Alex's apartment, and I would come along as a witness. If nothing else, I figured it would be an interesting way to spend the evening. When we arrived at Alex's apartment, I immediately felt a sense of unease. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room. Brick walked in like he owned the place, his eyes scanning every detail. "Whatever's here, it's been feeding on your fear," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Entities like this thrive on negative energy." Alex looked pale, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Entities?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You mean, like ghosts?" Brick turned to me and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ghosts are just one part of the equation. There are things much older and darker than mere spirits." As the night wore on, Brick began setting up strange equipment around the apartment. He placed salt along the windowsills and doorways, lit candles in a specific pattern, and used what looked like an antique compass that spun erratically. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and an oppressive silence fell over us. That's when we heard it, a low growl coming from the bedroom. Brick motioned for us to stay put as he walked toward the sound. I could see the tension in his shoulders, but he moved with purpose. Alex and I followed a few steps behind, our curiosity overriding our fear. The bedroom was freezing, and the growl had turned into a guttural snarl. Brick pointed his flashlight toward the far corner of the room, and that's when we saw it, a shadowy figure crouched in the corner, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. "Stay back," Brick warned, his voice firm. The figure turned its head slowly toward us, revealing glowing red eyes. My heart felt like it had stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Brick reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial of liquid. He hurled it at the shadow, and the figure let out an ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into thin air. For a moment, none of us spoke. The room felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "What was that?" Alex finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. Brick turned to us, his expression grim. That was just the beginning. When we returned to the living room, Brick began explaining what we had just witnessed. The shadowy figure was a manifestation of something far more sinister, a demon that had latched onto Alex's fear and was using it to grow stronger. "You're lucky we caught it early," Brick said. If it had been left unchecked, things could have gotten much worse. I could see the fear in Alex's eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope. Brick had managed to banish the entity, at least for now. But as we sat there in the dimly lit apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Brick seemed to sense it too. "This isn't a one-time fix," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Whatever was here might come back, or worse, it might bring others." Despite the terror of the night, I found myself intrigued. There was something about Brick, his calm demeanor, his knowledge of the supernatural, that made me want to learn more. And that's how I found myself agreeing to accompany him on his next case. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would take me deeper into the unknown than I ever thought possible. I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I agreed to join Detective Brick on his next investigation. After the chilling encounter in Alex's apartment, I was torn between fear and fascination. Brick had made it clear that the supernatural world was more vast and dangerous than I could comprehend. Yet I couldn't ignore the curiosity gnawing at me. Our next case took us to a small, unassuming house in the suburbs. A young couple, Sarah and Mark, had been experiencing strange occurrences since moving in 6 months ago. The incident started with harmless oddities, doors opening on their own, faint whispers in the middle of the night, but had recently escalated to full-blown terror. When we arrived at the house, Sarah greeted us with a mix of relief and desperation. Mark, on the other hand, looked skeptical, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You're the Ghostbuster?" Mark asked, his tone laced with doubt. Brick ignored the jab and stepped into the house, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Tell me about the latest incident," he said, his voice calm and steady. Sarah launched into a story about how she had been cooking dinner when all the knives flew off the counter and embedded themselves in the kitchen walls. She showed us the marks left behind, deep gouges that couldn't be explained by anything rational. Mark reluctantly added his own experience, admitting that he had woken up to find scratches on his arms and legs, as if something had clawed at him while he slept. As Brick listened, he set up his equipment, a digital recorder, an EMF meter, and several small devices I couldn't identify. He moved with practiced precision, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. "This entity isn't subtle," Brick said after a moment. "It wants your attention, and it's willing to hurt you to get it." Sarah looked terrified, while Mark's skepticism began to waver. I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of dread. If Alex's apartment had been unsettling, this house felt downright oppressive. As night fell, Brick instructed Sarah and Mark to stay in their bedroom while he and I conducted the investigation. "The less fear they radiate, the better," he explained. "Fear is like a beacon for these things." We started in the living room, where most of the activity had reportedly occurred. Brick held up a small device that emitted a low hum, its lights flickering sporadically. "What is that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "A modified spirit box," Brick replied. "It picks up frequencies we can't hear. Sometimes entities use it to communicate." Almost on cue, the device crackled to life. A distorted voice emerged, faint but unmistakable. "Leave," it growled. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Brick, however, remained unfazed. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone firm and commanding. The voice didn't respond, but the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air, and a sense of foreboding washed over me. Brick pulled out a small vial of holy water and began sprinkling it around the room, muttering something under his breath. The atmosphere grew heavier, and I felt an inexplicable pressure on my chest. "Whatever you are, you're not welcome here," Brick said, his voice rising. "This house is not yours." That's when it happened. The lights flickered violently, and a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Brick motioned for me to follow him, and we rushed toward the sound. The kitchen was in chaos. Chairs were overturned, cabinets were flung open, and a foul stench filled the air. But what caught my attention was the shadowy figure standing near the sink. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its form shifting as if it were made of smoke. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, and its presence radiated pure hatred. Brick didn't hesitate. He pulled out a small iron cross and held it up toward the figure. "You have no power here," he said, his voice steady. The figure let out a guttural roar, and the entire house seemed to shake. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but Brick stood his ground, reciting a prayer in a language I didn't recognize. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. With one final ear-splitting shriek, it disappeared, leaving behind an eerie silence. As we returned to the living room, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Sarah and Mark emerged from their bedroom, their faces pale but unharmed. "It's gone for now," Brick said. "But you need to cleanse this house and protect it. Entities like this don't give up easily." He handed Sarah a small bundle of sage and a piece of chalk. "Draw this symbol on every door and window," he instructed, "and burn the sage every night for the next week." Sarah nodded, her gratitude evident. Mark, who had been skeptical from the start, looked shaken but thankful. As we left the house, I couldn't help but ask Brick a question that had been nagging at me. "How do you stay so calm in the face of whatever that was?" Brick smiled faintly. "You get used to it. Fear only gives them power. The trick is to remember that you're stronger than they are." The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I replayed the night's events in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. Brick's world was one of shadows and mysteries, where danger lurked in the corners of the unknown. I had seen enough to know that I couldn't turn back now. Whatever the next case would bring, I was ready to face it, if only to uncover the truths that lay hidden in the darkness. But as I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us from the house. The aftermath of the encounter at Sarah and Mark's house left me shaken, but it also solidified my resolve to continue working with Detective Brick. His world was a dangerous, unsettling place, but it offered a glimpse into the mysteries of the unknown. I knew I was in too deep to walk away now. A week later, Brick called me with news of a new case. His tone was more serious than usual, and I could sense an undercurrent of urgency. "This one's different," he said. "It's not just about a haunting, it's personal." The case involved a mansion on the outskirts of the city, an imposing Gothic structure that seemed to radiate malice. The owner, Eleanor Grayson, was a wealthy recluse who had reached out to Brick after a series of terrifying events. She claimed that her home was under siege by an entity unlike any Brick had encountered before. When we arrived at the mansion, Eleanor greeted us at the door. She was a frail woman in her late 60s, her eyes sunken and hollow from lack of sleep. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to turn." Brick gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll do everything we can to help. Tell me everything that's happened." Eleanor led us to the sitting room, where she recounted a series of horrifying events. It started with whispers echoing through the halls at night, followed by objects moving on their own. But the most chilling incident had occurred just days before. She had woken up to find deep scratches on her bedroom door, as if something had been trying to claw its way inside. As Eleanor spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air in the mansion was thick and oppressive, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. Brick listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in his leather-bound journal. When Eleanor finished her account, he closed the journal with a decisive snap. "This entity is powerful," he said, "but it's not invincible. We'll need to act quickly." Brick began by setting up his usual array of equipment: EMF meters, cameras, and his modified spirit box. He also placed small iron symbols around the mansion, explaining that they would help contain the entity's energy. As night fell, the mansion took on an even more sinister appearance. The once grand halls were now shrouded in darkness, and the faint creaks and groans of the old house sounded unnervingly like footsteps. We started in the basement, a damp and cavernous space that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. The spirit box crackled to life almost immediately, emitting a series of distorted voices. "Get out," one voice growled. Brick's expression remained calm, but I could see the tension in his posture. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firm. The spirit box fell silent for a moment before a new voice emerged, softer but no less chilling. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could process the words, A loud crash echoed from the far corner of the basement. We turned to see a stack of old crates topple over, revealing a hidden door embedded in the wall. Brick approached the door cautiously, his flashlight illuminating a series of strange symbols etched into the wood. "This isn't just a haunting," he said, more to himself than to me. "This is something ancient." He opened the door to reveal a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I felt a deep sense of unease as we made our way down. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a small circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars containing unidentifiable substances, and a crude altar stood in the center of the room. "This isn't just a haunting," Brick said grimly. "This is a summoning chamber." Before I could ask what he meant, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The entity made its presence known in the form of a shadowy figure that materialized near the altar. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting and writhing, but its eyes burned with a malevolent light. Brick wasted no time. He pulled out a vial of holy water and began chanting in Latin, his voice steady and commanding. The entity let out a guttural roar, and the room shook violently. As Brick continued the ritual, I noticed the jars on the shelves beginning to vibrate. One by one they shattered, releasing a foul-smelling mist that seemed to feed the entity's power. "We need to disrupt the altar," Brick shouted over the cacophony. I rushed toward the altar, using all my strength to overturn it. The stone slab crashed to the ground, and the entity let out an ear-splitting shriek. Its form began to waver, and I could see cracks of light breaking through the darkness. Brick raised the iron cross and shouted one final incantation. The entity let out a final agonized roar before collapsing in on itself, leaving behind a deafening silence. When we emerged from the basement, the oppressive atmosphere in the mansion had lifted. Eleanor, who had been hiding in her bedroom, met us in the foyer, tears streaming down her face. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Brick gave her a reassuring nod. "It's over. But you'll need to have this house blessed to ensure it stays that way." As we drove away from the mansion, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But I also knew that this wasn't the end. There would always be more cases, more entities, and more mysteries to unravel. Brick seemed to sense my thoughts. "This line of work isn't for everyone," he said. "It's dangerous, and it'll test you in ways you can't imagine. But if you're willing to stick with it, you'll see things most people could never dream of." I nodded, knowing that I had already made my choice. The world of the supernatural was terrifying and unpredictable, but it was also endlessly fascinating. As we drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that our next case was already waiting for us. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.